UA Museum of the North is extremely proud to house the only articulated and suspended bowhead whale skeleton in North America. Bowhead whales are icons of the Arctic. They're a keystone species in northern marine ecosystems and are among some of the longest-lived vertebrates on the planet. More than that, they play a pivotal role in the lives of indigenous peoples for whom bowhead whales are an essential part of their culture and survival. I invite all of you to come and see this amazing skeleton and accompanying special exhibition and learn more about this remarkable animal. Next, we welcome UAF Chancellor Dan White.
Hi, I'm Dan White, UAF Chancellor. I'd like to express our sincere thanks to the Bill Stroecker Foundation for funding this project to honor the legacy of our friend Bill Stroecker. In his lifetime, Bill worked on many projects to shine a positive light on Fairbanks. And we here at UAF are honored to carry on Bill's vision of celebrating Fairbanks. This world-class exhibit lives in our world-class university and serves as just a piece of Bill Stroecker's legacy. I want to also thank the project team, including the UA Museum of the North, UAF Design and Construction, the Alcan Builders, Bettisworth North, PDC engineers, and many others who worked on this over the last 3 years, this one-of-a-kind exhibit to honor our friend Bill Stroecker.
Well, Bill always loved this community. The opportunity for the whale was one of the things that the trustees jumped on early on because it has so much significance for the Arctic and the Museum of the North. We thought it would be something that would really work on Bill's wanting to shine a light on Fairbanks. One of the things that he wanted was when people came to Fairbanks that they would remember Fairbanks and remember something about it. Having a bowhead whale suspended in the ceiling, so that they can walk around and look at it from different angles and whatnot is going to be something very memorable. And from that standpoint, I'm sure that he would be very pleased that we're participating in this project.
The whale was harvested in 1963 by whalers in Utqiagvik. They salvaged all the meat, of course, to eat in Utqiagvik, and then the skeleton sat on the beach until 1965.
There have been a lot of challenges that all of us have experienced. The first was figuring out if the ceiling would even support something that weighs nearly 2 tons, just the bones. Turns out that with some modifications, the ceiling will hold the whale. So that was one hurdle. The next hurdle was figuring out how to put a whale skeleton together when we were missing several bones and just assembling it.
My role in this project has been the museum's project manager for the assembly of the whale skeleton. I was preparing for the bones to be assembled. That's everything from cleaning the bones to making sure all the materials were here and everything was lined up and prepared for the assembly process to begin. And then I was also participating and helping assemble the whale with Lee Post.
I am one of the few people in the country that has a specialty of putting whale skeletons together. This whale is way different than other whales. The thing that makes the magnitude of this so great was kind of the condition of the bones. Real unusual thing to be able to get a skeleton from those. This bowhead is for being in the United States, it's a one of a kind.
The way in which we regard whales, they are an integral part of who we are. Too often we get put into the past as if we continue to exist in the past and are frozen in time. And having this exhibit helps with breaking that barrier down, that we are alive and well today, and we continue to rely very heavily on the bowhead whale for many reasons, spiritual, nutritional. Being able to have the opportunity to work with museum staff is to be commended.
This is a bowhead whale, and there is 4 or 5 of these in the entire world as far as we can tell. There isn't any more in the Americas, North or South America.
This will be a very effective visual hook to get people to come in and learn more about bowheads.
My hope is that they will come into the museum, be astounded by the size and beauty of the whale skeleton, inspires kids to learn more about whales, more about the Arctic, more about science and the natural world.
Thank you for attending this virtual celebration. We invite you to come and see the whale in person. The museum is open daily from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. all summer. We look forward to seeing you here.
All right, welcome. I'm Jennifer Arsenault. I'm the Education and Public Programs Manager here at the UA Museum of the North. The museum is located on Trothiada on the ancestral lands of the Dana people of the Lower Tanana River. Today I'm going to be talking with museum mammalogists Link Olson and Aaron Gunderson about bowhead whales and our newly installed articulated bowhead skeleton. And we recognize the Alaska Native peoples that have a long connection with bowhead whales. This aukvik was harvested by Inupiaq hunters from Utqiagvik. Inupiaq, St. Lawrence Island, and Siberian Yupik peoples have harvested bowheads for thousands of years. And so I think I'll just start with Link and Aaron, if you could tell us your title and maybe a little bit about your job here at the museum.
Well, my name is Link Olson. I'm the Curator of Mammals at the University of Alaska Museum of the North. I'm also a professor of biology in the Department of Biology and Wildlife at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And my job as curator is to oversee the growth, development, and use of the mammal collection. We have one of the largest mammal collections in the world. We're in the top 10 mammal collections in terms of numbers of specimens in the US. And our collection of marine mammals is unparalleled. We have the biggest collection of marine mammals in North America and probably the world. Those statistics are a little harder to come by. So as curator, my job is to make sure that the collection is provided with the best possible care in terms of financial resources, human resources, and that it's used responsibly, but by as many scientists who need to get access to it. So it's a research collection. The bowhead whale on exhibit is an exception in that most of our specimens will never be seen by the public. That's not the point of the collection. It's a research collection. But when we do make exceptions, they are exceptional.
And I'm Aaron Gunderson. I'm the Mammal Collection Manager, so I work with Link, but my job is different in that I'm managing the daily operations of the collection, making sure the specimens are properly prepared and curated with all the right data recording, archival quality standards, and making sure that researchers have access to the specimens they need when loans are requested. I work to fill them and get them shipped. When visitors come or researchers come to visit the collection, I get them access to everything they need to take the measurements or samples that they're using for their research. I sort of shepherd the specimens through the process from receipt at the door to archival in the collection's range. And with this bowhead whale exhibit, I was the museum's project manager for that and did a lot of the work required from cleaning the bones to building the skeleton and tracking the budget and all things in between to make that whale skeleton happen.
I'm going to jump back in and just add a little to what Aaron just said. My official title is curator. That word derives from the Latin word to care. in practical terms, Aaron curates the collection. He is the one providing the immediate care, and we are very happy to recognize him as the exhibits curator for the bowhead skeleton, to give proper credit where credit's due.
Excellent. And on that point of the overall collection, you said that, you know, we have this remarkable number of marine mammals in our collection here at the museum. We aren't on the coast. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, I'll comment first, then Aaron can follow up. As many people know, Alaska has more coastline than the remaining 49 states combined. And you would think that that would position us to receive a lot of the marine mammals that end up washing up dead on our shore or are harvested through subsistence use. And that's true, but as you just pointed out, we're far from the coast, and I can count the number of roads that actually go to the coast on one hand. So it's a tremendous logistical undertaking to get marine mammal parts or intact marine mammals from any part of Alaska's coastline, even the few points that you can drive to, back to the museum. So the fact that we do have so many marine mammal specimens in our research collection, I think, is all the more remarkable given those many challenges.
Yeah, and the reason they do end up here is that we work closely with the agencies that manage marine mammals and go on site to do necropsies of whales and other large marine mammals that wash up dead. And there are veterinary pathologists who take samples and other biologists working for the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration who try to determine the cause of death and the health of whales when they wash up dead. And they take tissues and save skulls for us when they can. And then we work to have them shipped here. So, and then we work with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game very closely to have samples from native harvested seals and other marine mammals that natives are allowed to harvest still. Alaska natives still hunt seals and some whales, of course. So our work with those agencies provide an influx of a lot of marine mammal material.
Yeah, and this whale was harvested in 1963. And, you know, as you pointed out, roads are not prolific in Alaska, and there are no roads between Utqiagvik and Fairbanks. So a number of questions have come in about how this 43-foot skeleton came to the museum.
Well, that's a complicated story. I can kind of summarize it. Just now I was discussing with Lee Post how that happened. He read through our files about our correspondence between Floyd Durham, who is the museum collector for that specimen. And at the time he was communicating with curator of this museum, Brian Kessel, about donating that specimen to this museum.
Because Floyd was from another museum. Floyd was collecting on behalf of another museum.
Yep, Floyd was very interested in bowhead whales, and he was working with the LA County Museum of Natural History. And at the time, in 1965, he came up to Utqiagvik and collected this bowhead whale skeleton and another one, and donated them to this museum at that time. And all the bones, he took all of the bones off the beach from where the harvest occurred and had them shipped here. I think he drove them in a truck himself. I don't know how they got from Utqiagvik to Fairbanks, because there was no road.
There's mystery in the story.
There are some gaps in our understanding of how it came here. So
my understanding is that those bones that could be flown commercially were done so, but the skull was too big.
Yeah, and the skull took a lot of coordination. There's a lot of correspondence about how the skull arrived. And we know that happened in 1969 when Floyd and Brian Kessel and other folks at this museum coordinated with the Alaska Air National Guard to have a large cargo plane carry the skull to Anchorage, where it sat for a little while, a few weeks or days, I'm not sure how long. And then it was then moved to Fairbanks in that same plane, provided by the Alaska Air National Guard.
And the skull is a significant portion of the skeleton, right? I mean, if you have a 43-foot skeleton, is the skull a third or?
Yeah, it's a quarter to a third of the whole length of the whale.
Yeah, wow.
It's,
That's
yeah, and
crazy.
our skull is 7.5 feet wide, and it's about 15 feet long.
Wow. So then when did this effort to actually articulate the skeleton begin? I mean, I know the skull has been on display in the Gallery of Alaska for decades. So then when did this latest effort sort of begin in earnest?
Well, I'll speak to that a little bit. The idea has been in place for decades and was formalized almost 20 years ago with the inception of the new museum space, which was completed about 15 years ago with a very noticeable, to those of us who knew what the plan was, space in the building to suspend a large-bodied whale.
In the museum's main lobby.
Exactly. And the design of the building, the architect was actually selected in part because of that feature. We knew it would be the crown jewel of the building. We've had the crown for 15 years now, but getting that jewel put together and installed didn't start in earnest until a little less than 2 years ago. And it traces its origin to the current idea to a humpback whale that stranded outside of Anchorage about 6 years ago. And we just happen to have some grant money because since this is part of my job, I'll keep hyping the fact that this is all very expensive. It takes many thousands of dollars to move a large whale just from Anchorage up here if we have to deconstruct it. And so Aaron led an expedition down to Kincaid State Park in Anchorage to deconstruct a humpback whale that had beached there. And humpback whales normally don't range that far north in Alaska. So the fact that there was one beached represented a very rare opportunity for us to salvage an entire skeleton. And it was very visually impressive. We had to commission a helicopter to sling out the skull, and that made the news. Aaron was interviewed, and that piqued the interest of someone with the Bill Stroker Foundation, who approached Aaron. And Aaron and I discussed what would make the most sense in terms of articulating and displaying a whale. And Aaron and I agreed that it made far more sense due to the cultural significance of the bowhead whales to actually do a bowhead. So we kind of did a bait and switch and said, yeah, we'd love to hang a whale in our building, but humpback whales aren't uncommon in museums. You can go to many museums around the country. You can go to a high school in Homer and see a complete humpback whale. Bowhead whales are far more rare. And once the idea of doing something so unique in a North American museum and having it be in our museum took root, it really took off from there. And then Aaron took over.
Yeah, and what have some of the main process steps been, Aaron? And I mean, there's kind of maybe been some main categories of work.
Yeah, well, that humpback whale salvage was in 2016, and shortly after that, because that was in the news in Anchorage and in Fairbanks, shortly after that, as Link mentioned, a person from the Bill Stroker Foundation asked me what would it cost to have that hung in the museum, and so that started the conversation in 2016. But it wasn't until 2018 that they had requested a formal proposal with budget numbers and something that they could then consider for full funding. So in 2018, we really started planning for how this would actually work and how much it would cost. And that's where myself and then the Department of Design and Construction at UAF took on the task of figuring out how to do it. And for about a year, we examined what it would take. There had to be modifications to the ceiling to support the load of the whale, as well as make the supports in a straight line to support the shape of the whale. And then I was figuring out how much it would cost to clean all the bones and have Lee Post, an expert whale articulator, come up here and lead the effort to assemble the skeleton. So that took about a year. And in 2019, December 2019, we had a meeting with the Stroecker Foundation to submit this sort of proposal presentation. And they considered our presentation for about a month. And in January 2020, they gave us the go-ahead to proceed with full funding and get started. So February 2020 is when I started cleaning the bones. That was kind of the first thing that needed to get going so that there was time to do that. And that was a year ago and a few months. And we started assembling the skeleton in February 2021. And just yesterday, we lifted it up into the ceiling. So.
And so there was, as you indicated, a really big process involved with engineering for the building and preparation. But on the mammalogy side, can you talk a little bit about the cleaning and preparation of the skeleton for putting it together before getting to that puzzle piece?
Yeah, so the bones of this whale had been kept in a Connex container outside for decades. They were uncleaned since they were salvaged from Utqiagvik in 1965. So they were still greasy and there was some dried tissue remaining on them.
And greasy because marine mammals are very oily.
Yeah, because whales they of course have a thick layer of blubber around them, and they also have oil in their bones to help with buoyancy. And so whale bones they drip oil as they sit. And the oil that doesn't drip out solidifies inside the bone to make this sticky, dirty mess. But we deal with that because we have lots of other whales for research purposes, and we clean whales on a regular basis, not really large ones because they're just too big to deal with. So for this one, we purchased an extra large tank. The way we clean whales and other marine mammals is we soak them in warm water, give them oxygen so that bacteria can rot away all the digestible oil and tissue and leave the bones intact. It's called maceration. So we bought a tank that's 8 feet by 4 feet by 3 feet deep. And that fit in 2 batches, that fit all of the skeleton bone, the postcranial skeleton. And those soaked for about 4 months in 2 batches. And then after the rotting process, it's as dirty as you would expect if you left a hamburger out in a bowl of water for 4 months on your kitchen counter.
Smelly, I would imagine.
Yeah, yep. So, but after that, there's soap and water and rinse, and then a soak in soapy water for 3 days, and then a rinse, and then a soak in clean water, and another rinse, and then let them dry, and hopefully they don't stink. You don't know until the end if you've achieved what you need to achieve. If we've achieved real cleanliness until they're dry and they don't smell. So that took 9 months.
And then after that process, hopefully you do have clean bones, but they're of course not Lego pieces. So then to actually articulate the skeleton and put the pieces together or join them for exhibit. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I want to mention the skull. Cleaning the skull was far simpler, but it was complicated because it was so large. So the other bones went through that process I just described, but the skull we had to wheel out of the building and lower to the ground on a hoist and wheel it outside. It required a custom-made cart, some very strategic maneuvering through our gallery, and then it was just scrubbed down with hot water outside over the course of about 2 weeks. Hot water and dish soap, clean the skull. But then assembling all the clean parts, that was Lee Post's expertise. and he's a resident of Homer. He's an expert at assembling large whale skeletons, larger marine mammals. He's done numerous skeletons for the Pratt Museum in Homer, and he's traveled the world on whale building projects to lead and assist in them.
Just to interject here, he's entirely self-trained, no formal education in comparative anatomy, and he's literally learned how to reconstruct mammal skeletons by deconstructing them himself. And it's an unpleasant task for much of the process. So he has literally written numerous books about it. Aaron's got one there.
This is his pre-project manual for our whale.
With amazing illustrations and.
Yep. He's got a manual for lots of different sizes and different animals, and he does these illustrations. He's an expert at what he does. He draws everything. It's really quite amazing.
And this project was an exception in a couple of ways, one of which he always tries to involve school-age children in the process and teaching them about how to clean bones and put them back together, which also entails teaching them a little about comparative anatomy and the natural history of the organisms. And his reach and impact is just profound, that so many people have learned about something they would realistically never learn about had he not come to their school, to their village, to their town to help them put this together.
And then, of course, with the timing of this, that wasn't, an opportunity that we could take advantage of with the reconstruction of our skeleton during coronavirus times and pandemic restrictions. So
the original plan was to have Lee here, and I was his school-age child, and he taught me and our technician Marissa Breslin how to build a whale. The original plan before COVID was to have our workshop open so that the public visitors to the museum could come in and ask us questions and see the whole process. But of course, everything shut down and we were closed for a long time, and then visitation was limited and nobody was traveling. It became a closed door operation with just Lee, Marissa, and me doing the work to assemble the skeleton.
were there any advantages to the fact that, the museum was closed for a time, or anything about this timing that turned out to be somewhat, of a surprise advantage?
Yeah, it made so we did the assembly in our auditorium where we usually show movies and visitors buy movie tickets, and there was some discussion of maybe not using that space because it would be a loss in revenue for the museum while the project was going on. But since everything closed down, it made it totally obvious we can use that large space because we wouldn't be open to moviegoers anyways. That made the use of that space totally available and very convenient, and we ended up filling it up. Our other option was our classroom, which was significantly smaller, but would have worked also. Other advantage, there's an advantage of not being on display while doing something that you've never done before. So there were fewer distractions of people watching us and asking us questions, but
one of the other advantages that relates to how we generally operate as a research museum is that most scientists around the world were shut down. They couldn't get into their labs. They couldn't do the research on our specimens that they would normally be doing. And that also means that because we had shut down our loan operations, most of our actual scientific use, or most of the scientific use of our collection, happens through loans. And if we're unable to process loans, that in theory frees up a lot of time among our staff. The other thing that we should acknowledge is that many of our staff were on furlough as a result of COVID.
Yeah.
So we had less time in terms of personnel hours to work on this, which makes the fact that we pulled it off in a little over a year all the more remarkable.
Right. No, and I think that's a story certainly that museums can appreciate museum personnel. A lot of folks were laid off in the museum world entirely, and certainly furloughs were a real reality for scientific and educational staff at museums around the country and around the world. So I wholeheartedly agree with you. It was amazing that such a project was able to continue and could, just come to fruition. It was really amazing.
And I think the other thing it did psychologically is it made our sense of purpose very visual and present. And even for many of us who couldn't actually come into the museum during the peak of the pandemic, the online presence, for which Roger Top deserves a lot of credit, and your department and Aaron for running the department's Facebook page. People know about this and they've known about it for months. I get questions from colleagues all over the country asking how this is going. And, it was a much needed, very bright spot of good news in an otherwise very dark year for museums and the rest of the world.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll ask another question kind of specifically about this bowhead, and then maybe I can pepper you with some questions about bowheads in general that some people have shared. So for this one, the bones show evidence of the whale's life, its death, and biological processes after that. Can you share a little bit about that? Some of the things that can be observed on this skeleton?
Sure, yeah. So we decided early on not to pretty up the bones and make them artificial in any way, so that we could tell all the stories that the bones have to tell. So there's evidence of the actual impact of the harpoon that killed the whale at the time of the harvest. Some of the bones were broken and they've been put together, but the repairs are obvious and you can see where that damage was done. So there's the story to tell about the cultural history of whaling and how they actually harvested this whale. And then all the marks left from the butchering process as well are still visible. There's lots of cut marks, and some of the ribs are broken. Some of them are missing pieces. Those that were broken, but still were able to be repaired, we put them back together, but you can see the damage, and there's one rib that has a metal splint alongside it where two pieces are held together with a plate of steel. And we didn't cover any of those marks up. We didn't artificially bleach the bones. A lot of museum skeletons end up being pristine white or very, very close to super white through a bleaching process, and a lot of them end up being repaired such that you can't see any defects or variations that were part of the whale's life.
This specimen, even though it's on display, is still part of our research collection as well, and that factored into our decision on how to treat it. Bleach damages a lot of the natural chemicals and molecules in an animal, specifically DNA, but other compounds as well. And we want this to continue to serve the scientific community in perpetuity. We considered the windows and the amount of UV light that's actually transmitted through the windows, which is a minimum, thankfully, because that went into the building's design. We won't be able to easily remove bones, which was one of my high hopes, but hanging something that heavy from the ceiling and making the individual elements removable was just too challenging.
We do have leftover, there are pieces left for sampling. One of the ribs actually was too broken to repair, and so we have two fragments of the rib from this specimen, as well as the bone dust from drilling holes through the vertebrae. There's lots of material left for chemical analyses on the bones from the specimen that can still be loaned to researchers.
And then do the bones also show, before they were harvested from the beach, they sat for a while, and do they show evidence of what may have happened to them there aside from harvest?
Right, yeah. So it was harvested in 63, and then the collector didn't collect the bones till 65. And there's evidence of scavenging on many of the vertebrae have chew marks where the tips of the vertebrae have been chewed off. It's distinct from the cut marks that occurred when the animal was butchered. So you can see evidence of, and polar bears and Arctic fox are the two primary scavengers of a carcass like that. And scavengers with teeth anyways. There are birds that would have pecked away bits of flesh too. But that's all explained in the interpretation of the exhibit, and those things are pointed out in the display, the interpretations, the interpretive display panels that describe, you know, what to look for and help you see the evidence of these different activities on the skeleton.
Right. Well, then maybe we can take a moment to talk about bowheads as a species. Why is it called a bowhead whale?
I'll answer that. They're called bowhead whales because of the shape of their cranium, the top part of the skull. It has a very pronounced arc, which isn't uncommon in baleen whales, but it's very obvious in bowheads, both because of the arch itself, but also the relative proportion of their heads, as we talked about earlier. About up to a third of their total body length can be composed just of their head. And they use that arch to help break through the surface ice to breathe.
Oh, and do they have two blowholes?
So all baleen whales, which are the filter feeders that use those giant plates of baleen and they lack teeth, they all retain the two openings that come out their nose on the tops of their skulls because it's been pushed back a little bit. So those are called external nares, and you can just think of them as the same nose holes that we have. In non-baleen whales, one side of the external nares has been sort of retracted back into the skull and closed over. So I think sperm whales, for example, only have one blowhole. It's their right nostril. It's the same as our nostrils. And in baleen whales, when they spout, you can actually tell that they've got two blowholes because there's a slight fork in the plume that comes out. So it's actually more accurate to say non-baleen whales only have one blowhole because that's the derived condition.
Gotcha. And as baleen whales, what do bowheads eat?
They are skim feeders, they're called, and they're eating, so they don't do huge gulps like you see humpback whales gulping large schools of herring, but the shape of their bow actually helps them skim or go near the surface of underneath the ice or near the surface of the water, and they're filtering out tiny little creatures, krill, tiny shrimps, copepods, the little tiny creatures that live on the edge of the Arctic ice. And there are examples of that in the special exhibits gallery. You can see under a microscope, they're visible, the little shrimps and krill. They're small.
They're such a large animal.
They're small, and a whale will eat millions and millions and millions of them in a single gulp. And that's, yeah, and they use that baleen to, the krill, all the water and all the things they're eating go in, and then they push the water out with their tongue through their baleen. And of course the water goes out and the baleen filters the edibles inside their mouth, and then they swallow that.
Wow.
So,
and
yeah,
you mentioned the
huge
Arctic.
Animals living on tiny creatures.
Tiny creatures.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Arctic. Can you share a little bit more specifically where bowheads live?
They're distributed around, circumpolar Arctic is their distribution. They only occur in the Arctic Ocean, as far south as into the Bering Sea, around Alaska, and there's actually a population that lives in the Sea of Okhotsk in Russia, far eastern Russia, around the Kamchatka Peninsula. And then they occur on the other side of the Arctic, on both sides of Greenland, and in the northern islands north of Scandinavia.
They are the only baleen whale that's endemic to Arctic waters. So only found in Arctic waters. And that's one of the really striking contrasts between them and humpback whales. Humpback whales are cosmopolitan. You can find them pretty much anywhere. They only spend their summer months in Alaska. Those that come to Alaska, there are summer populations all over the world. And that's kind of another reason we wanted to display and center an exhibit around the bowhead. It is much more of an Alaskan species than the humpback. And our population in particular, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration recognizes different populations of all marine mammals, but and they call those stocks, which isn't necessarily a biological circumscription, but it does tend to jive with population genetics. And of the 5 recognized stocks of bowheads, the stock in Alaska, I'll think of it as Alaska's population, is doing the best of all those from a conservation standpoint. And as we like to say, it represents one of the rare success stories in marine mammal conservation.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask a little bit about that because they are listed as an endangered species, but as you said, Western Arctic bowheads have shown great recovery since the end of commercial whaling. You've already shared a bit about populations in different places. Is there anything else to add about habitat for bowheads?
Well, like much of the Arctic, their habitat is threatened by climate change, changes in sea ice extent and annual duration. As the Arctic opens up to increase shipping, that's likely to have an impact on their migration patterns, calving. We simply don't know. And that's another reason to showcase it, is to bring greater global attention to a species that's likely to be imperiled by climate change, just as it's recovering from the cessation of commercial whaling.
How old was this bowhead when it was harvested? Do we know that?
It's hard to age a whale at all, but estimates have been made by the North Slope Burrow biologists who track bowhead whale harvests and the biology of the whales in the Alaska Arctic Ocean. And based on the skull length, it's a measurement they use to estimate age. This whale was 25 years old, which makes it certainly not full grown, but an adult that is reproductively active. We're calling it a subadult in growth. It's a male, and it was measured at 42 feet long. But the 2 other partial skeletons of bowheads we have in the collection are 50 feet and 55 feet. So they get.
And how old can they get to be?
Over 200 years is what we say. I think there is a method for aging mammals using the lens of the eye, changes in the lens, and Link knows more about this.
Yeah, so our eye lenses accumulate proteins throughout life at a predictable rate. And if this is one of the beauties of having an extensive series of the same species in a museum where people have access to them, is if you do have known age individuals that maybe you've observed in nature or reared them in captivity, there's a very tight correlation between chronological age of an animal and the weight of its eye lens. Now, we don't have the eye lens from this whale. The use of eye lens weight as an indicator of age is a relatively recent development, and it requires preserving the eye lens in specific chemicals and not allowing it to freeze. That's something we do now. If we get a new specimen that hasn't decomposed and hasn't frozen solid, we actually save the eyes and the eye lens. The other common way of dating mammals or aging mammals is by looking at sections of the teeth, which, kind of like trees, accumulate growth rings over age, but baleen whales have no teeth. There's another very fascinating way that we can establish minimum ages for some whales that I'll let Aaron tell you about.
Sure. There was a very, very interesting story or event that happened, I think in the early 2000s. One of the whales harvested north of Alaska was found to have a harpoon embedded in its body that dated to the mid 1800s. And so and that harpoon was one that was manufactured only in a short window of 5 or 6 years. And so it was only in use and was then obsolete after something in the mid 1800s. And so when this whale was harvested with that found in it, it was dated at a minimum age, because it had to have been alive to get shot with that harpoon, at 130 years old. And then based on the size and the measurement of the skull of that individual, it's presumed to have been, I think, more than 180 years old.
Wow. And do we know why can they live so long?
I don't know.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Another question was, what color? What color are bowhead whales? You can't tell by looking at the skeleton.
No,
They're whale colored.
yeah,
What colored?
they're whale colored. They're dark. I've never seen one, and but you know, in images, they're like most whales. They're dark as I presume, a sort of camouflage to blend in with the darkness of the ocean water. Bowheads get some white coloration around their lips as they get older. I don't know why that is, but they're mostly just dark gray, almost black, but not black.
Visitors can come and see photos of bowhead whales at our exhibit, and they can also watch our short documentary film on the life of the bowhead on the museum's YouTube channel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as well as art pieces from the fine arts collection that document whaling harvest and would show color there too.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is really cool about bowheads, or maybe just marine mammals in general?
I'll answer that. I'm an evolutionary mammologist, so I study the evolution of mammals, and there are really two evolutionary transformations over the course of the evolution of all mammals that really stand out as truly remarkable. One is the evolution of sustained powered flight, so bats. That's only happened once in mammals. The other is the evolution of a fully aquatic life cycle. So being born, spending your entire life and dying in the water without ever coming onto land. That's happened twice over the course of mammal evolution. Once in the common ancestor of all living whales and dolphins and porpoises, and the other time in the common ancestor of manatees, dugongs, and the extinct Steller sea cow. And that transformation, we know based on the fossil record, at least in the case of whales, took place in evolutionary terms in the blink of an eye. In a little over 10 million years, we went from a fully terrestrial, four-legged mammal to a fully aquatic whale-like animal. And 10 million years sounds like a long time, but for such a radical modification, that's really fast. And having such an exquisitely preserved, displayed example of a whale skeleton this big at our museum will, I think, really impress upon our visitors and college students. There are lots of classes that are going to use this in their lab now. Will really impress them with just how extraordinarily modified an organism with the same bones you and I have can become thanks to evolution. So that's what I find spectacular about marine mammals and whales in particular.
Yeah.
That's awesome. How about you, Aaron? Do you have anything to add?
Well, that's the big one for most biologists. Whale evolution is very well studied because of it's well documented in the fossil record and super amazing. And the evidence on the skeleton for that would be much of it is, you look at the flippers and they look like hands. They have all the same bones. They have a couple extra bones in their fingers, but you can put your hand next to that whale's hand and see that these are the same structures. And then what we have on the skeleton also is the bowhead's hind limbs. So whales have completely lost their external hind limbs, but the bones that form the pelvis and the femur are still in the body of bowheads, and that's evident on our skeleton. What I find most fascinating about this skeleton in particular, not just whales also, but it's the wow factor that when you walk in the museum now, you're going to be face to face with a giant whale skeleton. And as we were building this in the last week, it was out in the lobby and people were coming in, and little kids would immediately say, "Wow, mommy, look at that dinosaur." And it's obviously it's a whale. And then there's a teachable moment. Now that's a whale, and there's some dinosaurs in the lobby too. This is a dinosaur, this is a whale, but you spark that inspiration in kids and adults when you can see just the immense size and the bone structure, how similar it is to humans. It just triggers a lot of inspiration and interest in kids in particular, but some adults are still kids and they can be inspired as well.
Yeah, and it's really neat to have it, like you say, they're near the dinosaurs, but the largest animal ever to live was a whale, not a dinosaur.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, thank you both very much for taking some time to chat and share your knowledge, and I'm really excited about this bowhead and hope everyone gets a chance to come to the museum and see it.
We're excited too.
All right.
Thanks, Jen.